no, sorry. And anyway, yeah, okay. No, not the last one, sorry. It's a third one, a stronger, yeah, it's okay. Yes. So our first panel this morning looks at Europe's role in NATO. A stronger Europe makes NATO stronger. And it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Boris Ruge, NATO Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy. Mr. Ruge, you have up about 7 minutes for your introductory remarks, and then we open the floor like we did yesterday with a ping-pong session, so one question, one answer. So, Mr. Ruge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, honourable members of Parliament. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here and to speak on behalf of NATO and our Secretary General, Mark Rutte. I understand this is the first meeting of its kind, and this combination of the European Parliament and defence committees of national parliaments, that's of course a first-rate audience, and I'll do my best to tell you something that you may not know yet or to make it interesting. I'll want to update you on yesterday's foreign ministerial meeting, which was the halfway mark between the summit in The Hague and the summit in Ankara that will happen in July of next year. And of course, I will talk about the EU-NATO relationship, which is so crucial to meeting the challenges that we face in security and defense. But before I do that, I want to take a step back and reflect on how we got to where we are, which is a Euro-Atlantic area that is not at peace, to quote NATO's strategic concept, and the largest land war, the largest war in Europe since 1945, consuming thousands of lives each month. After the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the West worked to develop a positive relationship with the Russian Federation. NATO in particular, as many of you know, invested a great deal in the partnership with Russia, which was the most privileged partnership that NATO has ever offered to a third country, based on the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 and the Rome Declaration of 2002 that created the NATO-Russia Council. But as it turned out, Russia under Vladimir Putin was unwilling or unable to move away from its imperial mindset. There were many data points, including President Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference of 2007. But even after Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, many in the West did not fully grasp the nature of Russian policy. It took 2 invasions of Ukraine by Russia to change that and to drive home the reality of Russian policy. I think it would be a fair statement, and I can say this also as a German diplomat who was involved in these issues at the time, Europeans were slow to adapt and to get their defense in order. Parliaments in many European nations were not eager to increase defense spending, nor were the voters they represented. To summarize, it was Russia that started the unprovoked war against Ukraine. It was Russia that chose confrontation with the West. And it is Russia today that is trying not just to overwhelm Ukraine, but also to refashion the European security order as a whole. And that is what underpins our whole approach to security and defense today. It explains why NATO Secretary General has made clear that the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Council are today dead. And of course, it also explains why our strategic concept of 2022 describes Russia as the most significant and direct threat to our security. And it is the reason why NATO nations at the summit in The Hague decided on very ambitious defense spending goals that will take us to a combined 5% of GDP for security and defense by 2035. An enormous increase in defense spending. And we, of course, are perfectly clear that this is a very heavy political lift for all of you in your parliaments. Turning to yesterday's foreign ministerial meeting, it reflected the key decisions of the Hague Summit. Firstly, to build our deterrence and defense based on those new ambitious spending goals. Secondly, increasing the capacity of our defense industrial base. And thirdly, continuing to support Ukraine so it can continue to defend itself understanding that Ukraine's security and our security are very, very closely linked, that they are, in effect, identical. In this regard, let me just say that we are, of course, following at NATO very closely the negotiations with regard to the reparations loan. It is not a NATO issue. It is for the European Union to decide, but we know full well that we need the financial resources to keep Ukraine in the fight, and so we are very interested and we are in close touch with our EU colleagues. The points that I mentioned, building deterrence and defense, building our defense industrial base, supporting Ukraine, are also the points that will underpin the agenda in Ankara in 6 months' time or 7 months' time. And how does all of this relate to the European pillar of NATO, which is the topic of the session today? I think you could say that the Hague Summit represents a fundamental recalibration of NATO, with European allies and Canada taking more responsibility and rectifying an imbalance that we had for many decades in NATO, where the United States effectively were looking after our security. In part, this is to be seen against the background of the United States having to deal with the challenge of a rising China in the Indo-Pacific. So Europe needs to be more able to look after its own security and defense. But of course, we must also keep the United States of America engaged in Europe, because Europeans cannot look after their own security on their own, and because the security of the Euro-Atlantic area as a whole, including the US and Canada, depends on a strong NATO. It is in this context that the term European pillar has come back into fashion. It is not a new term. It is a term that has existed for decades, but now is the time to develop the concept and to give it meaning. It certainly means Europeans taking on more responsibility. It does not mean creating an EU pillar in NATO. That is not the meaning of the term as we see it. Instead, a European pillar that represents something real must include the non-EU allies of NATO, including the United Kingdom, Norway, Turkey, and the others, because without those non-EU allies in Europe, a European pillar would not achieve what I would describe as the critical mass. It is interesting in this context to look at France's 2025 strategic review. I recommend it to all of you. That talks specifically about a European pillar and offers a definition that includes these non-EU allies. And it is also interesting to reflect on the fact that Secretary Hegseth of the United States just a few months ago spoke about a European-led NATO, which is a pretty interesting statement coming from a U.S. Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War. In all of this, EU-NATO cooperation is key. It's a big part of my job. The EU's capacity to generate resources and to regulate the internal market is crucial. It's not always easy to get that cooperation right because our memberships are not identical. But I can tell you that I work very closely with senior colleagues on the EU side, to include Charles Vries of the EAS, to include André Denk of the European Defence Agency, and John Watson of the European Commission. So we have a very close cooperation. It is very important to us, and we try our best to take this EU-NATO agenda forward. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you very much. So we could start. And we start with MEP Wouter Beke from EPP.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a very concrete question about the European pillar. We have since 2002 the Berlin Plus agreements. What is the actual state of play of the Berlin Plus agreements? In this perspective, can Europe use the NATO facilities when, according to the Berlin Plus agreements, they decide to come to action in one way or another?
Thank you very much for the question. So indeed, Berlin Plus is there, and it is in use, as we can see in the case of EU4 Althea, where the operations commander is a French three-star general who is the vice chief of staff at Allied Command Operations, also known as SHAPE. and that is the chain of command that goes down to the commander of EU4 Althea in Sarajevo. So the NATO command structure in this case is being used to carry out what is quite an important operation in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
So the next will be Mr. Luís Dias from Portugal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will speak in Portuguese. Good morning, everybody. Senhor Secretary
General, or Deputy Secretary General, given the security situation surrounding Ukraine, with the increasing unpredictability and instability of the U.S. president in this conflict, with the risk of response through conventional weapons, but also the increasing risk of hybrid threats, what's the main threat here with respect to NATO and its strategic autonomy? So your opinion then, what would it be? What could we as Europeans do in terms of major investments, military, industrial, European industry? What can be done in order to increase our military autonomy, to increase Euro-Atlantic security, and with the relationships between the European Union and NATO in order to reinforce this pillar, to make sure it's effective without having overlap or competition between the two? And what sort of timeline are we looking at with respect to the European plans for defense to ensure we have a stronger Europe militarily? And what can we do in order to ensure that we act quickly and more predictably and more sustainably for Ukraine, whilst striking the right balance with the different responsibilities we have for our collective defense? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can you put up your hand so I know what direction I should be looking into? There you are. Okay, thank you very much. I saw you on the screen, but not in real life. So I think the starting point is increased defense spending, which is what we agreed in the first instance in 2014 at the Wales summit. But in the years following 2014, the commitment to go to increased defense spending was not delivered by many European nations. It was a very, very slow increase. So in effect, it took the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, the full-scale invasion. And I think you might say it took two elections of President Trump in the United States of America and very strong pressure from the US government in order to move the needle. And the needle was moved in a very big way at the Hague summit. And what we can see today is different. So what is happening in the aftermath of the Hague summit is different from what we saw in the aftermath of the Wales summit. The defense spending in many nations is going up very significantly, very quickly. So I could mention the case of the Baltic countries or Germany or Sweden. There we can see a very rapid, very substantial increase in defense spending. So it's not just words on paper, it's happening. That defense spending, I think, allows us to equip our armed forces. It sends a demand signal to our defense industrial base in Europe. It is clear that we must build our defense industrial base. There's not enough capacity in North America and in Europe to equip our troops rapidly in the near term. So we're hoping that this demand signal will lead to a defense industrial base that can deliver faster for our own armed forces and, of course, for Ukraine as well, to help us equip Ukraine in its defense against the Russian war of aggression.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mr. Pavel Fischer from the Czech Republic.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you for your words. You just said that the member states succeeded to raise their expenditure for defense in a very significant way, and you named several of them, but you didn't name the others. So the level of engagement is not the same. We see probably that the perception of the threat is not identical. And on the contrary, we have to see that Ukraine's security is a part of security of Europe. If Ukraine is destabilized, whole Europe is destabilized. And I thank you that you named Rome Declaration from 2002. This is a very interesting text in which Russia engages itself to respect borders. By the way, this is the same as in 1975 Helsinki Final Act. So we have here a criminal who does destabilizes the whole continent, and the perception of threat is not still very the same. How would you explain to our constituencies, because we in the parliament can do the job with you, that this is an imminent threat and that expression of our willingness to deter, of the political will to fight, is also translated in our defense spending? How would you phrase it for everyone, not only for Poland or Estonia or Finland, but for everyone in NATO among European allies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you're quite right. Geography is a factor. I think we can say that the closer allies find themselves to Russia, the stronger the threat perception. I think that's true. But in reality, all of us are threatened by Russia. The flight time of a Russian missile to Western Europe is not much longer than the flight time of a missile to Berlin or to Brussels. So all of us are threatened. We can see that Russia is very active in the Arctic. So via the Arctic and the North Atlantic, the United States of America and Canada are also threatened. As we all know, the Russians have a major, their most important nuclear base is up on the Kola Peninsula. That's where they have their submarines with nuclear missiles, right? Those assets are not primarily directed against Europe. They're also directed against the United States. So we should understand that it is shared security. And then, of course, NATO talks rightly about a 360-degree concept of security. The sort of most significant and direct threat is Russia to the east. But we have a lot of instability on our southern flank as well. And it is not by coincidence that NATO's strategic concept talks about terrorism as the most significant asymmetric threat. And I think it would be unwise to neglect the threat from terrorism as well. So I think we have to come together. All allies have signed up to their national capability targets under the NATO defense planning process. All 32 allies have signed up to the Hague Defense Investment Plan, as we call it. I realize that in the real world, not everyone will deliver at the same pace, but I think we are moving in the right direction, and of course we are trying to make the case. And engaging with parliaments is, of course, absolutely crucial. So I'm very happy to be here with you today.
Thank you very much. Next will be MEP Sven Mikser from S&D coordinator, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Assistant Secretary General. A comment followed by a couple of questions. First, regarding the defense spending increase, I remember after the 2% pledge made at Wales Summit, we were always reporting on the success and saying that it was only 3 countries, now it's 4, it's going to be 5 countries that have reached the target, but it was always the smaller countries that did so in the easternmost parts of the alliance, and it's quite obvious that the exemplary performance of the Baltic countries will not be able to compensate if some much larger member states in the southern and western part of the continent fail to actually meet the target, and many of the easternmost allies actually wanted to put the target at somewhat closer, rather 30 rather than 35, which would have made it sort of easier to assess the progress. But then you also mentioned the 5%, but we know this 5% consists of 2 separate parts. Are you satisfied that there is a sort of sufficiently common or shared understanding as to what we will collectively get for this extra 1.5% on top of this 3.5% of strictly military defense spending? And finally, NATO is obviously a consensus organization. And we depend on the ability of our political leaders to build a consensus. And we know that we are at considerable odds. I mean, on the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean when it comes to the fundamental parameters of the possible Ukraine peace arrangement, and it is not an issue, it is the issue that will define the future security of our continent. So what needs to happen, in your opinion, or what can we do to actually make sure that these differences will not undermine or erode the sort of critical political consensus among the allies?
Right. So as you rightly say, sir, NATO is based on consensus, and it is the job of the Secretary General and people like myself to get to that consensus by bringing 32 allies together. It's hard work. We spend a lot of time on it, but I think historically we've been quite successful in bringing allies together. And of course, 32 allies is harder than 15 allies, which is what we had in the late stages of the Cold War. Are we getting what we want? I think you can see Mark Rutte making the case day in, day out for allies to deliver on defense spending, for allies to deliver support to Ukraine. So it is not something that happens by itself. It takes, I think, political leadership at the national level. It takes leadership in parliaments as well. But I'm confident that we're moving in the right direction. So we can see that many NATO nations are, in a sense, ahead of the curve. Because we're talking about moving from where we are today to a 3.5% goal on core defense spending by 2035. But we have quite a few nations that will get to 3.5% by 2030 already. That's what Germany, for example, has said it will do. And of course, we have the Baltic countries, in many cases, close to 5%. I think in most cases, close to 5%. Now, we have Poland well above 4%. So this is significant. And of course, in the run-up to the Hague summit, we had a number of allies who were not yet at 2%, so who had not delivered on the Wales commitment. But by the end of the year, we will have all at 2%. That is what nations have promised. So I think we're moving in the right direction. What needs to be delivered are the capability targets that have been agreed with each nation, each of the 32 NATO nations individually. And I don't know to what extent Admiral Vandier went into this yesterday, but I think the challenge, of course, is as we learn from the conflict that is happening in Ukraine, are we sort of updating those capabilities? Are we keeping up with technological change and innovation cycles? That's a big challenge, I think, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mr. Dimitros Karidis from Greece.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to report to our colleagues here that in yesterday's ministerial meeting of NATO's foreign minister, Secretary Rubio was once more absent. And he was replaced by his deputy, Mr. Landau, which is fine, provided that he had the decency to stay throughout the meeting. Unfortunately, as I hear, he left after he delivered his speech and listening to the first few ministers. As a result, the remaining 26 ministers from Europe and Canada spoke among themselves without the Americans in the room, apart from the US ambassador, poor Mr. Whitaker, who is trying to preserve the appearance. Now, because this happens all the time in NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, where I'm leading the Greek delegation, the Americans are consistently absent. Even when we went to Dayton last year for the NATO summit, there was only one American congressman out of the numerous US delegation. I wonder if the Americans have already departed and we haven't noticed. I heard you speak about the Putin speech in Munich in 2007. You said nothing about the equally shocking speech of J.D. Vance in the February Munich conference this year, in 2025. Now, you have Mark Rutte, who is doing everything possible to keep the Americans in, even going all the way to what an honest observer would think of as an undignified performance. I would like to remind our audience that Mark Rutte, when he was a national leader, he made everything possible for the Netherlands to have the lowest percentage in defense spending in Europe and keep it close to 1%, well below the Wells, as you mentioned, 2014 commitment to increase. Now, given all this, is there a concern in you personally and more broadly in NATO that there might be an agreement between Americans and Russians to keep NATO constrained, not to enlarge, not to station troops where we should station troops, and not to provide for defense, etc., 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 behind our backs, given the sorry state of affairs that we are confronted with today?
Thank you very much. So just to say that it is true that Secretary Rubio did not attend the foreign ministerial meeting. However, this is not something that happens all the time. It is something that is quite unusual. I think it is explained by the circumstances, and the U.S. was represented by Deputy Secretary Landau, as you say. On the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, well, I mean, ministers do leave the room, I can tell you, for bilats. That's quite normal. On the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I'm very familiar with Mike Turner and many other members of the U.S. House of Representatives who are very active in that field. So I'm not sure. I was, as acting Deputy Secretary General a year ago, briefing the NATO Parliamentary Assembly plenary in Montreal. I don't know whether you were there. There was a good turnout from the Americans. So I would not agree with what seems to be...
No, there wasn't. And Mike Turner, who is a native of Dayton, brought the summit to Dayton, and he was the only one in Dayton. Only Mike Turner.
Colleague, sorry, please.
Okay. So my recollection of Montreal is different, but that doesn't matter. Now, is there a concern about NATO being sort of constrained? I think you may have noticed the reference I made to a recent statement of Secretary General Rutte, in which he highlighted that the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Council were dead as a result of Russia's aggressive behavior. And we can see, for example, that Germany is putting an armored brigade into Lithuania on a permanent basis, which is the kind of thing that would not have been done if we believed that the NATO-Russia Founding Act still was valid. It is, I think, also very clear that there can be nothing about NATO's interests, NATO's fundamentals, or the interests of the European Union and its fundamentals without NATO and the EU being involved in the process. So I think that is clear among 32 allies that this is something that cannot happen. And it came out very clearly in the discussion among foreign ministers yesterday.
Thank you very much. Next will be Mrs. Victoria Nielsen from Lithuania. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Sir, you have presented very amply the fact that Russia has been given very good, very preferential treatment with NATO prior to starting on its imperialistic rampage. So clearly, providing good conditions, trying to engage doesn't work. That Europe, NATO, and other partners have tried and failed many, many times. But, my question is about the fact that Mr. Putin a few days ago said that if Europe wants a war, it will get a war. But on our side, on the European side, Prime Minister of Belgium yesterday said that Russia will not lose. It's a fairy tale. That anyone who believes it believes in fairy tales. My question is there still a widespread belief that there is some happy medium that Russia doesn't lose and Europe doesn't lose? Because in Lithuanian point of view, I believe in the Baltic point of view, and in our region's point of view, pretty much if Russia wins, Europe loses. That's either this or that. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed, I think an imperialist and aggressive Russia winning this war would be a massive blow to our interests. There's no doubt about it. Once again, I don't think across national parliaments in Europe and in the European Parliament, there's great joy about massively having to increase defense spending, right? Because it means less resources for other things that are important to you and your voters. But this is a situation that has been forced upon us by a hyper-aggressive imperialist Russia. I'm afraid there's no other way of putting it. And it is also clear that that the future of Ukraine is fundamental to the future European security architecture. Right? If Russia were able to overwhelm Ukraine, conquer Ukraine, or dominate Ukraine politically, it would change the security situation in a fundamental way, and it would increase the pressure on us. Perhaps 3.5 or 5% of defense spending would not be enough. We would have to do even more. Because right now, the reality is that 100 plus Ukrainian brigades are holding off 100 plus Russian brigades. But now imagine a situation in which Ukraine is absorbed into some kind of Russian reconstituted empire. Then you have your real challenge. Now, President Putin in 2022 went for a gamble for this full-scale invasion. And of course, he has been unable in almost 4 years to achieve his strategic objectives. He has lost 1 million of his troops, killed or wounded. In the past months, on average, he has lost something in the order of 20,000 men per month on the front. He has burned through huge amounts of equipment. So this is what he has gained as a result is a few percent of Ukraine's territory. So adding to the 11% of Ukraine's territory he controlled in February 2022, maybe another 6, 7, 8%, all of which has been destroyed as a result of this intensive warfare. So what President Putin has to show right now is not very impressive. And Ukraine will be able to continue to fight and defend itself if we continue to support Ukraine. And Ukrainians, I think, are not minded to give up and to submit to Russia because they have learned what that means in terms of torture, rape, killing, and repression. So I think the Ukrainians will fight, and it is in our strategic interest to help them. And this is a case where the strategic interest of Europe aligns with our values, which is that you don't get to disregard the United Nations Charter, you don't get to disregard fundamental norms of international law, invade your neighbor and annex that territory. So I think the values and the strategic interests in this case align 100%.
Thank you very much. The next will be MEP Willy Sovendal from Green.
Thank you very much, and very much welcome here. I'm a Danish MEP, meaning I'm one of the Baltic Sea countries, but I'm also an Arctic country. So somehow these are the two main conflicts I think we're going to deal with the coming years. We visited Ukraine in March, just after the Americans had pulled their support, the economic support, the military support, and the intelligence support which meant that 5 times as many people were killed because they did not have time to get them into protection when the bombs and the things came. Just after that, there was a meeting in London where all the European countries, not only EU countries, but also, of course, Britain, also Norway, also Canada, also Turkey met. And at the same time, there was a meeting in Paris among the military chiefs. The impressive things to note is that this was NATO minus US. Why that? Because there was a general concern, how far can we trust US for the time being, when it's really, when it's serious. We cannot plan from what we hope. I mean, I think you as a military chief would warn against that. Do you plan both for the best scenario and the worst scenario? And the worst scenario would be the US not committing the agreements we have in the Chapter 5 NATO. That's my first question. Second question regards Ukraine. Imagine, as you said, that Ukraine is under Russian control, 800 very well-trained troops with combat experience, with all the innovation they brought, that would threaten for decades Europe in its present situation. Just to say, it's so important on the 18th of December that Europe decides to use the frozen assets that we can finance and Ukraine can finance the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. So the Baltic and the Arctic, both very important. Baltic, of course, a place where Russia has engaged in hybrid operations. I think we've been able to contain that to some extent with something called Baltic Sentry, what is in NATO speak called an enhanced vigilance activity, more ships, more surveillance, unmanned drones. Maybe Admiral Vendier got into that yesterday. But I think that's one thing. The Arctic is very important. In the old days at NATO, we would say high north, low tension. So we're not, as NATO, we're not going to be very present, we're not going to be very active in the high north because we don't want to militarize that space, we don't want to provoke a reaction from others. But the reality today is that Russia and increasingly China are present in the Arctic, that we have a new situation, that we have new sea lines of communication in the Arctic. So it is something that we have to deal with. And today in NATO, 7 out of 8 Arctic states are part of our alliance, now that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. So Russia is the only Arctic country outside, and the A7, as we call them, are very much engaged on this issue, and NATO is becoming more and more, paying more and more attention to the Arctic, something we have heard from our Canadian colleagues as well, who now have to look north and think about how they secure the north, which in the old days was an area that in military terms was not something they had to pay attention to. Now they have to pay attention to it. Do we plan for scenarios without the US? In NATO, in terms of our deterrence and defense, we have our defense plans, which very much include the United States. And it would be very difficult to execute those defense plans without the United States because they are the backbone also of our conventional defense today. Now, if we deliver on the commitments made in The Hague, we will be able to do more ourselves, but it will take us a long time. It will take us a decade or so until we get to a place where we could operate with a significantly reduced US engagement. And on Ukraine, the meeting that you mentioned, I would just say those were meetings that were about a future security presence, a future military presence in Ukraine, which the United States government at that time had ruled out. And the coalition of the willing, with UK and French leadership, had sort of taken this forward and had developed plans and a command structure. And that is a very welcome thing, to show that Europe is going to put its money where its mouth is.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mr. Ricardo Carvalho from Portugal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will speak in Portuguese.
NATO continues to be a major axis of our collective security, but it faces challenges, external threats that are increasingly aggressive, and at the same time needing to find a way to link in with the EU's security and defense policy. I think it's clear we can't compete between NATO and the EU. We need to have complementarity. European defense can only be credible if it can support the European pillar within the alliance, ensure greater capacities, more investment, and more interoperability. And Portugal is an ally which is in favor of both, is of the view that we need to be in the front lines. We really need to be committed, invest in real capacities, whether it's maritime or cyberspace or other, and work on joint missions. But the big question here is this: will we ultimately be able to work beyond the political and bureaucratic barriers to this sort of cooperation between NATO and the EU to produce concrete, quick results on the ground? And another question: how can we ensure that European investments in defense will avoid overlap and truly reinforce capacities created? Now, in a context where threats are rapid, hybrid, and global, we cannot just discuss structures. We really need to integrate. Europe needs to take on more responsibilities for its defense, but always integrated within NATO, which continues to be the hard core of our collective security and defense. A European pillar which is stronger will ensure a NATO that is stronger and a Europe that is safer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To start with, a remark on the Atlantic, given Portugal's geographic situation. If you look at the Atlantic and the Arctic, I think it becomes clear that you need all 32 NATO allies to pull in the same direction to look after their security. And the Atlantic, of course, is the crucial link here, and it is not something that we can assume will be safe from Russian sort of interference and Russian actions. Now, how do we make this European pillar work? I think we make it work by accepting a fundamental premise, which is that NATO is the organization that looks after our collective security. And a European pillar functions within that alliance, and it has to be a European pillar that is not just the European Union in terms of EU institutions and EU member states, but it is the European pillar to include the UK, Norway, Turkey, and our other non-EU allies. If you were to subtract the combat power of those non-EU allies that find themselves in Europe, then you end up with not as much as you would like to have to look after our collective defense. That's the reality. So we are very, very focused on keeping that together. We also, of course, work on the basis primarily of the NATO defense planning process. That is what ensures one process that underpins our defense plans, that attributes capability targets to individual nations, so that at the end of the day, we have the capabilities that allow the Supreme Allied Commander Europe to execute the plans. That's how it works. We, of course, have some defense planning happening on the EU side as well, but I think the NDPP, in terms of collective defense, has to be the core of defense planning. And I think we are seeing from the European Union today very, very significant contributions. I worked on what was then called European Security and Defense Policy, ESDP, more than 20 years ago in the German Foreign Office. And at that time, the focus was on military and civilian operations and missions, the crisis management. I think today we can see that the key contribution that Europe can make is precisely in the area of generating resources, regulating, so that Europe brings its economic and technological power to the table and helps on our collective defense. That's the key thing, and we can see it documented in so many of the things on the table, including the Defense Readiness Roadmap and all the other documents that have been put forward.
The next will be Mr. Francesco Conde from Spain.
Microphone, please.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Hablar en
Yes, thank you. I'll speak Spanish. I would like to thank you very much. And I would also like to thank you because you refer to a complete vision, a 360-degree vision that NATO is applying, because it also considers other sectors and other actions, not only the Russian threat. Of course, this is one of the main points that NATO is working on, but there are other threats that you have spoken about, such as terrorism, and terrorism is also a danger to the southern flank. Now, I would like to ask if you can give us more details on the NATO agenda for the southern flank. What are the priorities you're working on? And I especially would like to know what type of dialogue NATO is having with its allies, especially with the European Union. What is the framework? What are the capacity targets? I'd also like to know about infrastructure investments, because these are necessary so that we can work on prevention and dissuasion on the southern flank. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my deputy is a Spaniard by name of Javier Colomina, and he is also the Secretary General's special representative for what we call the Southern Neighborhood. This goes back to a decision at the Washington Summit in 2024, where heads of state and government adopted the Southern Neighborhood Action Plan. There was a push for over a number of years, especially, of course, from allies on the southern flank, but also from others, that we should articulate our sort of our interests and identify instruments in order to engage with the southern neighborhood. And the result of that was a Southern Neighborhood Action Plan. It was based on an expert group that was chaired by a former Portuguese state secretary. So quite a good process and quite a good product, I would say. And so we engage systematically with the Southern Neighborhood. Those are the partners of the Mediterranean dialogue, primarily North African countries, as well as Jordan, as well as Israel. It is the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative partners. Those are primarily Arab Gulf states, or not primarily, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. Iraq is a partner of NATO, and of course also host to the NATO mission in Iraq that supports Iraqi security forces. So we have quite a big portfolio there, and we have a very intensive dialogue. At the same time, it is clear that some of the tools required in the relationship with these southern partners are not available at NATO. They're not part of our toolbox, so to speak. They are, however, very much part of the EU's toolbox. And that is why working with the EU is very important, because the EU has trade, it has development assistance, it has infrastructure in its portfolio, which we do not. So Javier Colomina does engage a great deal with his counterparts here on the European side, the special representatives, colleagues in the Commission and the EAS, and it's a very productive relationship.
So the next will be MEP Malika Sorel. Your floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir, for your presentation. You very correctly talked about the naivety that we had about Vladimir Putin for a long time. Can you just put me straight on this? I think given the increase in tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed, I think there's a certain amount of naivety vis-a-vis the US at the moment. And like children who have to leave the parental nest, we need to think about that possibility. And I think we have a bit of a complex when it comes about the US. And I don't think we should have any complex, because without Marquis de Lafayette, there would be no US. They'd still be under British governance. you talked about the UK. I don't think we can compare the two. We saw that when we looked at migrants coming from Turkey. We can tackle issues directly or indirectly. What BRIC countries do you think we could address to try and detach them from Russian influence? That would mean that we as parliamentarians could actually take action. And you talked about the quality of the action plan for the southern flank of NATO, particularly when it comes to migratory flows. I very much doubt whether that's actually going to work. And what can we do to make that plan a bit more robust? Thank you.
And thank you for reminding us of the Marquis de Lafayette, who, of course, is very high certainly in my estimation of his historic contribution. I would say this: NATO is a nation of democracies, is an alliance of democracies. And in the 76 years that NATO has existed, we again and again have had turbulence in domestic politics. I would say today there's a level of turbulence in domestic politics across much of NATO. We live in an age where some of the fundamentals are questioned. Voters elect parties that question some of the fundamentals of our security and defense policy, or other issues. And the Secretary General and people like myself, we work on behalf of these 32 allies, and we have to sort of work to bring them together to find a common denominator. And that applies to each and every of the 32. So we are not in charge, as you of course know, of economic policy and customs issues and so on. But of course we are aware that this can create friction and does create friction. It is not something that we can resolve. What we are focused on is keeping the 32 together on a common basis, and in the face of the most significant and direct threat, which is Russia, to enhance our deterrence and defense. The UK and Turkey, for me, of course, as a NATO official, are both non-EU allies in Europe. And they're both important, and we both, in both cases, we are very keen to work with them. Turkey, of course, is significant in the sense that we have a number of issues that are very sensitive here. If I go back to sort of my early years working on ESDP and the decisions of the Nice European Council and other things, there are some elements there that I would say, as a NATO official, the EU would do well to study carefully. So I think when ESDP, what is today CSDP, was created, we made some promises to NATO and NATO allies, including Turkey, about consultation, about inclusion, and so on. And I think it is extremely important that together we deliver on those promises, because if we don't, I think it creates friction. Finally, on the BRICS, I think that's a very important point. NATO has something in the order of 30 plus partners. That includes our Indo-Pacific partners, but Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand. But we also have a dialogue with other countries outside of our partners. For example, part of my job is to be the senior official engaging with the People's Republic of China, which is, of course, not a partner of NATO and has no intention of becoming a NATO partner. But we think it's important to engage with the People's Republic of China. We also think it's important to talk to nations such as Indonesia, or other ASEAN countries. So we are out there, and we use the opportunities we get at the UN General Assembly, at the Munich Security Conference to have these conversations, the Shangri-La dialogue, and we do try and reach out. This is important also when it comes to arms control issues, and arms control is very important to NATO. And we are coming up in a few months against the review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in New York, which I will attend as a senior NATO official. And that is one of the fora where we very much have to engage with a very broad range of countries. The chairman of this NPT review conference is a Vietnamese diplomat, and it's very important that we talk to these countries about our security interests, about our perspective, and that we also listen to them, and that we somehow try and maintain a basic level of dialogue and understanding.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mr. Carmelo Abella from Malta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning to everyone. In your opening remarks, you acknowledged that membership in NATO and the EU are not the same. In fact, my country, Malta, is an EU member, but not a NATO member. So I'm talking on behalf of the minority here. How does NATO look at this fact, and what collaboration is going on with non-members in general? I have to say, however, that my country, Malta, supports a stronger EU defense that complements and also collaborates with NATO and contributes to global security as well. Of course, taking into account our constitutional realities, and that commitments undertaken by allies within NATO cannot be imposed on EU member states which are not part of the alliance. However, I would like to add something else on the Mediterranean, being a Mediterranean country, and you already answered my colleague from Spain regarding the southern neighborhood. What challenges do you see, and what kind of cooperation in a tangible way is going on both shores? Rightly so, you mentioned the north of Africa. I know that at present, maybe the attention of NATO is concentrated maybe elsewhere, but we have to acknowledge that challenges are present, and that we need to take care that nothing comes out of that part of the region, which will be, a massive blow as well for NATO to tackle at the same time issues that might increase from that region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. So to pick up on your last point, absolutely, the southern neighborhood, as already mentioned, is important to us. We understand very well that a combination of factors sort of has led to a situation where we have a great deal of instability across the region. It's a combination of many things. But it leads to instability. I spent, I think, 8 years from 2008 until 2016 working on the Middle East and in the Middle East, including as ambassador in Saudi Arabia. So I know a little bit about the region, and I very much believe that we have to keep an eye on it. Once again, our toolbox at NATO is limited. A lot of this is about political dialogue. It is about working with colleagues in foreign ministries and defense ministries and the armed forces. But that already is I think, a good avenue. And I think, of course, we have to keep an eye on terrorism as a sort of a threat. It is a cyclical threat, but we would be very wrong to neglect it when it is perhaps less prominent. It is something that can always come back. We were very happy to see that this year we were able to reestablish the joint sessions of the North Atlantic Council with the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. We had some trouble for 2 years in holding those meetings, but now we have them, and I think that's a very important forum for NATO and EU senior officials, ambassadors, to come together and to discuss. Of course, we do have conversations with our Maltese colleagues as well as with the other non-NATO member states of the European Union. That's very important to us, and we learn a great deal from those.
Thank you very much. And the next will be Jani Koko from Finland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. allies are the cornerstone of US global power. They have it's something that they have, but the Russia and China doesn't have. So at least I believe that if something happened in Europe and Americans wouldn't act, they are not only going to lose Europe, but all the allies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. No one could ever trust those commitments that America has given to its allies. So at least I believe that they are just wanting us Europeans to do our fair share with this common defense. So I would like to hear your comments on this analysis. The second question is more about our southern flank. I know that there is also threats coming, as we have heard, from North Africa and Middle East, migration, refugees, terrorism, but those threats we already can handle with those capabilities that we have, because we don't need tanks or armies to stop terrorists coming from across the Mediterranean, but we need those to defend us against the Russians. So how do you see how we can combine with these two different kind of threats and make sure that we boost our defense capabilities, especially with this conventional warfare?
Thank you very much. So let me start with the US commitment. Our view is that the US is very much committed to NATO. That includes President Trump himself. I spent 3 years in Washington, D.C. during the first Trump administration as the Deputy Ambassador of Germany, and I remember very vividly the critical attitude that President Trump and his first administration had towards NATO, which was based on the perception, which was accurate, that European allies were not living up to their commitments. Now, I think that as a result of the Hague summit, the attitude of President Trump has evolved in a very remarkable way. I think the way that he speaks about NATO and NATO allies today is very different from what we heard previously, and that is because there has been a fundamental recalibration where European governments have said, we will take on the responsibility, we will take on these new commitments, and we will deliver on them. So I think that has made a huge difference. And of course, it is not just the administration, the executive branch, it is also the US Congress, where NATO has many, many supporters, and it is US public opinion. If you look at US opinion polls on NATO, they are quite positive. There's a lot of support for NATO. So I'm not so concerned about the US dropping out of NATO. To the contrary, I see a very strong commitment on the part of the US government. You're right that the capabilities, the tools you need to address terrorism are quite different from the tools you need to deal with the most significant and direct threat, which is Russia, right? That's true, but I think we do both things. We have counterterrorism organization within NATO, both in terms of the International Secretariat and the NATO command structure. We engage with partners on the southern flank, and at the same time, of course, the defense plans that we have produced over the past years, they're very much focused on Russia, and they include all those big military capabilities that you would imagine. And of course, Finland now being an ally, I think we have a very capable partner who knows a great deal about how to deal with that threat coming from the east.
Thank you very much. The next will MEP Isabel Wieseler Lima. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to be with us and to answering all these questions like this. I want to come back to something you evoked in the beginning. So in this context of the US turning away his interest from Europe, you evoked the fact that I think for many of us it's obvious, but I think also that it has to be highlighted, that the European pillar cannot be only the EU. We have to include clearly Norway, UK, and so on, and also Canada. Now, my question would probably be better answered in camera format, but I will be nevertheless very happy to hear what you can tell us. How is Turkey positioning itself? I feel like it's a big elephant in the room. And also in this context, it has been named, the BRICS has been named today. They are not a member, but they have a special status, like in BRICS. So I really wanted to know what we can expect, because they are inside. And yes, listening to you would be very important for us, I think. Thank you so much.
So I would not say that the US is turning away from Europe. What I would say is that what we can see in the Indo-Pacific is the rise of China. Now, that is not, if you like, for us to criticize. China has undergone a very, very remarkable development since the 1980s. Enormous economic growth, bringing millions or hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and turning China into what is essentially a peer competitor in many areas with the United States, in terms of the size of its economy, in terms of its level of technological development, but also in terms of its military capabilities. The buildup of China's armed forces, especially the Air Force, the Navy, and the strategic rocket forces, is sort of without precedent, certainly since 1945, and probably we could go farther back. So the Chinese Navy today has more ships than the US Navy. The strategic rocket forces by 2030 will be taken up in terms of the nuclear forces to a level that will make China something that is close to a peer of Russia and the United States. So it's a fundamental change, and therefore it is logical that the United States of America, as an Indo-Pacific nation, needs to deal with that. What it is trying to do is to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, as I understand it, that will allow nations in the Indo-Pacific, to include US allies such as Japan, Australia, the Republic of Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, to make their own choices and not to be dominated by a regional power, which is China. And that is why the US needs to devote resources to the Indo-Pacific. And at the same time, the commitment to NATO is there. Right? And it is fundamental. And it is in our interest to maintain it. And in order to maintain it, we need to build up European capabilities so the Americans don't feel that we're just letting them do the work. So the more we do as Europeans to build up our deterrence and defense, I think the better our chance of keeping the US engaged in European security and defense for the long term, which is also in the Euro's interest, as I've already pointed out. On Turkey, as a NATO official, I work for 32 nations. I work for Germany as much as I work for Turkey and Finland and Portugal. So Turkey is a very important ally in a very important sort of geostrategic position. And we are very happy to have them as part of our alliance. In that sense, within NATO, we have to navigate sometimes bilateral issues. And we have done that for 76 years. And I think we have the experience of saying that navigating those issues within NATO is better than having them outside of NATO. So Turkey, very important, and the host of our next summit, and we're happy to have them.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mr. Vincent Blondel from Belgium.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll express myself in French if that's okay for you. Merci beaucoup pour votre présentation, Monsieur Ruge.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very interesting. Now, you were speaking of the number of dead, the number of injured. It was millions. You've spoken of the soldiers who have been affected in the Russian aggression of Ukraine. I think you spoke of 20,000 people. Now, from what I've understood, more than half of this situation, many of the deaths are linked to drone attacks. And this is something that was unexpected just a few years ago. Now, you have continued to speak of the number of allies and partners that we have in NATO and the need to decide by consensus. Now, this is not the situation that China finds itself in, as you said, nor Russia. So in a context such as this, how do you think NATO can move forward? We have this way of making decisions. We have consensus, so it takes a certain amount of time, but we need flexibility. We need to adapt to a situation. So what can we do to adapt quickly? Like we have to for drones and for future military technologies. So what can we do when evolution and change is so swift?
It's a very good question. We have innovation cycles in the war in Ukraine that play out, within the space of 6 weeks or 2 months, there's a great deal that we can learn and that we need to learn from the war in Ukraine. We try to do that via a number of mechanisms. One of them is called JTEC, Joint Analysis Training and Education Center, which is a joint NATO-Ukraine body that has been established in Bydgoszcz in Poland, where we try to learn from Ukraine. Our support to Ukraine that is delivered via NSATU, NATO Security Assistance and Training to Ukraine, which is a NATO command in Wiesbaden, Germany, that works with 3 logistic nodes in Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. Also teaches us a great deal because we have a very close cooperation with the Ukrainians there, and the equipment that we deliver in line with their requests and the training that we deliver in line with their requests teaches us a great deal about the reality of warfare today, which, as you all know, is a very remarkable combination of 20th century warfare with tanks and artillery and all those things we know, and trenches. And at the same time, cutting-edge technology, including drones, including the application of artificial intelligence to organize the battlefield, to understand what is going on, and to target what you need to target. So I imagine that Admiral Vendier yesterday had a few things to say about this, because that is part of his job at Allied Command Transformation, to think and to anticipate changes and to help the alliance to move there. But of course, it's hard work. It's hard work. And you're right, of course, a nation state, an individual nation state can oftentimes be faster than an alliance of 32, but we're doing our best. And then we have created institutions such as the NATO Innovation Fund and Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, in order to bring in innovation, in order to support innovation across NATO states. So it is very much on our mind. And since you mentioned those 20,000 casualties per month of Russian troops over the course of this year, we welcome at NATO the U.S. efforts to bring the war in Ukraine to an end, because the loss of life is staggering. On the Ukrainian side, oftentimes civilians who are targeted by Russia, but also on the Russian side. We take no pleasure in Russian casualties. But we also believe that the war needs to be brought to an end in such a way that Ukraine emerges as a sovereign, independent state capable of making its own choices. So both things, I think, have to be kept in mind.
Thank you very much. Now our colleague MEP Martin Stakis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sir, I'm MEP from Latvia, and we have long-time history with imperialistic Russia. And if there's one thing we have learned, is that Russia despises weakness. Every time they smell the weakness, for them it's like a green line to move forward. And we clearly saw it in 2014, because the response from the West was quite weak, and this mostly encouraged Russia to attack Ukraine. So yesterday, Commissioner Kubilius said that basically Europe is in a full-scale hybrid war with Russia. And we can see this in all domains, on the sea, when they cut the cables, on the land, the sabotage acts in Poland, and of course in the air, they're violating our airspace. Last time I asked you the question, what is NATO response to this? And your answer was that NATO response is asymmetric. We try to hit their economy, put more sanctions, we increase our capabilities, we invest in our military industry. But for me, it seems that it doesn't stop Russia, and it's basically just encourage them to continue the hybrid attacks against us. And since that time, these are basically has been just increased. So my question to you is if this asymmetric response is still effective? Is it the right strategy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we have to differentiate between hybrid operations, a Russian hybrid campaign that has been playing out for some time across many NATO nations, and actual war. It's two different things. NATO in the past has said that hybrid actions could amount to an Article 5 situation. But what we're seeing is sabotage, is disinformation, is cyber attacks, in some cases targeted assassinations of Russian opposition figures, for example, on Allied territory. This is very serious stuff, but it is not war. And dealing with it is complicated because if you were, if we have an act of sabotage, then our police and our justice system will go out and our intelligence and try and find the perpetrators. But finding the perpetrators and putting them in jail, I think, will not solve the problem. So I think you need an asymmetric response. You also need to think about what is it that Russia is trying to achieve with this hybrid campaign. What it's trying to achieve is to destabilize our political and social systems. And what it is trying to do is it is trying to persuade us to lessen our support to Ukraine, right? So I think the proper response to that is to double down on our support to Ukraine. And that is, in fact, what many NATO nations have done. I agree with you that the response after 2014 was too weak. I think there's been a series of publications. I don't know whether the chairwoman has read any of them. Recently, a book about German Russia policy published a month ago called Das Versagen, the failure, right? And I'm afraid that there was a level of failure in understanding the reality of Russian policy and responding to it. Where we do push back is, of course, Baltic Sentry that I already mentioned under Sakura's command, and Eastern Sentry, which was the enhanced vigilance activity that we instituted after the airspace violations in Russia and Estonia. And I think Baltic Sentry has proven to be quite successful, and I think Eastern Sentry is also successful in integrating our surveillance, integrating the systems that we have, adding aircraft and other systems on the eastern flank to protect us better against Russian hybrid actions.
So we have a few minutes left. So is there any spontaneous question? Now you have the possibility. If not, Wouter, please, from Belgium, my MEP colleague.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to come back on my first question also after hearing what you answered. You said the Berlin Plus agreements are still on track. Okay. But what does it mean exactly? In the Berlin Plus agreements, it stated that the US, or that every country, but I take this case, the US has the right of the first refusal. If that is the case, hypothesis, there is an attack coming to one of the Baltic states, coming from Russia. And the United States said, okay, we will use our right of first refusal. We will not intervene. What is the status of the Berlin Plus agreements. Does this mean that within the NATO, that the European countries, the member states of the European countries, member of the NATO, can use the NATO capabilities, the planning, the communication, the headquarters, and so on? Can they use the full backbone of the NATO? Also included the American backbone of the NATO. Because I think this is very important. When we are talking about the European pillar of the NATO, then we have to be sure that is the full pillar of the NATO. Because I think that in Europe we don't want to be dependent upon the President of the United States saying, I don't want to intervene, but you will also have not the backbone of the NATO. Because if that is the case, then we have to organize ourselves in Europe in a total different way than in the perspective of the European pillar. So that's my question. Can we use all the NATO capabilities on behalf from the European side if there is the right of first refusal of the United States?
So it may be that I haven't looked at some of those founding documents of ESDP, CSDP for a while, but I believe that Berlin Plus relates to crisis management operations, not to collective defense. When it comes to collective defense, an attack on one ally is considered as an attack on all under Article 5. And there's no doubt that the United States of America would be part of that response. And that is also very much needed, whether it's in the conventional field or whether it's in the nuclear field, about which we have not talked today, but which, of course, is very important in a day and age where President Putin and members of the Russian leadership, not to mention the talking heads on Russian TV every day, in and out, talk about the use of nuclear weapons against NATO nations, right? That is a sort of daily theme on Russian TV. So there's no doubt. Of course, I realize that in the Treaty of the European Union, we have Article 42.7, which is kind of talks about collective defense. But I believe there's also a shared understanding that collective defense is exercised through NATO. And of course, we have the example of Finland and Sweden, who decided against the backdrop of Russia's full-scale invasion to join NATO. And I think they joined NATO because they believed that NATO would be there if they were ever to face an Article 5 scenario. And I think they're exactly right to assume that that will be the case. So Berlin Plus, I think, applies to crisis management operations, but I stand to be corrected, and I'll look it up once I get back to my office.
So for this panel, the last question will be Mr. Dimitros Karidis from Greece.
Yes.
Next 1.5 minutes, and then Mr.
I'm a little perplexed by your comment that we are a community of democracies. And I wonder how this comment is perceived by all those honorable citizens of Turkey who give their life to defend democracy in Turkey and find themselves in prison. This is not an anti-Turkish comment, and it's not a comment questioning Turkey's membership into NATO that is old and stable. But it is a question about your comment. Do you really need to say all this about democracy? Aren't you afraid that you will be accused of being hypocritical? Aren't you afraid that this might make a mockery of our democratic values, both inside Turkey and outside? And finally, in how many numbers of political prisoners, there are hundreds, if not thousands these days in Turkey, including the popularly elected mayor of Istanbul, in how many numbers of political prisoners does Turkey stop being a democracy for you?
It doesn't stop being a democracy for me. As a historian, which I once was, I would concede that if we go back to the founding of NATO, not all of the original founding members of NATO were democracies. But I think overall, NATO has played a very important role in promoting democracy and in establishing a security umbrella that created the best possible circumstances for democracies to develop, for economic development to take place. So the enlargement of the European Union, bringing in Central European countries and Eastern European countries, I think would not have been possible without the enlargement of NATO, providing the security and the framework for democracy, market economy to develop. So democracies, I think, have been challenged. I think in member states of NATO, in member states of the European Union, of the OECD, of the OSCE. So I think the reality today is that there are challenges to democracies in many places, but NATO is an alliance of democracies, I would maintain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruge. Thank you very much, colleagues. You could see how important it is working together, EU and NATO, and EU not as NATO 2.0 or 1. We have different jobs to do, but working together for our freedom and peace. So thank you very much for your time. We have now a short coffee break. Please come back in the room at 11 o'clock. Then we have our fourth and the last panel for today, with we have to change a little bit, with Benedicta von Seher-Voss. She's Managing Director at the European External Action Service, and she will be here. And so just a short break, and I'm looking forward to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Madam Chair.
So, colleagues, we want to continue. Maybe you could take a seat. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we are at the last panel, and about the final panel closed a discussion that has shown one thing above all: Europe stands at a critical turning point. And over these 2.5 days, we heard the same message again and again: new threats, new technologies, new responsibilities. The question is no longer theoretical. The question is whether Europe will be ready to act. So Ukraine has shown that victory depends on timely intelligence, resilient logistics, stockpiles, counter-drone systems, and command and control. But Europe still lacks unity, speed, and interoperability. It's my pleasure to welcome Benedicta von Seher-Toss, the Managing Director at the European External Action Service for the Common Security and Defence Policy. So, Benedicta, just to start for about 7 minutes about our security, and then we have the ping-pong system, so our colleagues have the possibility asking questions, and then you could answer immediately. So thank you very much, Benedicta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I'm very happy to be with you today and discuss European EU security and defense. It has really become a central priority for us. I think I've never seen that security and defense is an issue that is talked about as much as is the case at the moment. I think there are very few discussions that are happening in the EU that don't involve security and defense. You can see that, for example, at the European Council. Every single European Council this year, so the meeting of heads of state and government has addressed defense. The same goes for also the meetings of defense ministers. We had many more of them, and we will continue to have more. And of course, that is also thanks to you, because you are the voice who carried into the populations, to the citizens. You really play a crucial role, and I want to thank you for that. It's hugely important to raise awareness, to ensure that people understand why it's important to invest in defense. It's important to have the popular support, to have also the funds that we need to do our work. and also, of course, to push your national administrations to continue along the road that we have set up. So business as usual, that is clear, is not an option. The reasons are well known for that. I want to start with Russia's war in Ukraine. That is really an existential threat also to Europe's security as we know it, and the direct threats to our democracies, for example, through the Russian destabilization attempts that we really witness every single day. And then, of course, we have the escalating crisis in our neighborhood. So now more than ever, we are also witnessing increasing intersection of European security and global security. What does that mean? It means that something that happens in Europe directly affects another part of the world and vice versa. I think one of the very clear examples are the fact that Russia globalized the war in Ukraine. You know that China has become a very important enabler of Russia in this war. We have North Korean soldiers fighting. We have North Korea providing military equipment. The same goes for Iran. And of course, this doesn't come for free. It also means that equipment, technology goes back, for example, to North Korea, which again has direct effect on the Korean peninsula. So everything is linked, and we can't. Geography as such doesn't make us safer. The stakes in defense are very high. We see that everywhere. One other aspect that underlines it is also the whole task of burden shifting that is happening on a transatlantic level, and that is talked about a lot in NATO. You just said Boris Ruge here. I'm sure he talked about it, which means, of course, that we as Europeans need to take on a much bigger role in defense, and here the EU also plays a crucial role. I want to raise 3 key challenges for Europeans that we need to face in going forward. The first of them is the need to continue support to Ukraine, whilst, of course, adding pressure to Russia. So the starting point for us are, what does Ukraine need? What are the military needs for my work, for example? We know that the budget needs, when we look at only the military needs in Ukraine, are over 100 billion euros next year. Half of that will have to be financed by partners, which also means that the sum is huge. It's twice as much as the EU and its member states provided this year. And the Commission has proposed different options to cover these critical needs to keep Ukraine in a strong position, and we know that financial support plus, of course, support in terms of equipment is key to keep Ukraine in a strong position. Then strong armed forces are the best security guarantee. We often say that, and we as EU do as much as we can to support that actively. For example, through training, we have trained over 80,000 soldiers so far, and we will continue. And we are also looking into, can we change the mandate of the training mission to, should conditions allow, and that is very important, train also in Ukraine and not just on the territory of the European Union. We also support the civilian security forces in Ukraine. You might know that the EU has a civilian mission there, EU AM, with around 400 people on the ground. And there we also extend our support, for example, to support Ukraine with in its hybrid threats, cyber, and also in the reintegration of veterans, which is, of course, a huge task. I said we also want to put pressure on Russia. Here, sanctions are very important, and important sanctions do bite. Russia's annual inflation is at 7.7%, much higher than its growth. Its reserves are draining fast, and energy revenues are down 20%. Russia lost over 159 billion from oil exports, and the shrinking access to international financing leaves Moscow scrambling for cash and increasingly reliant on China. At the same time, we know that Russia has prepared its military budget for next year, which is now at $166 billion. Then the shadow fleet carries nearly 70% of Russian oil and petroleum exports, and by containing this fleet, we significantly affect Russia's ability to finance its war effort and remove a risk for our critical maritime infrastructures, for example, subsea cables. And our main response so far came through sanctions. 556 vessels have been listed to date, and we are also engaging with third states to deflag EU-sanctioned vessels and refuse them port services. The second challenge is on defense readiness. I'm sure you heard a lot from Commissioner Kubilius on this earlier. It's important to do more. There is much more money being spent, which is good, but we also need to spend it in a good way. Money as such is not a panacea. What is a panacea is that we cooperate closely. We do procurement, for example, jointly. And as I said, the task is huge due to the burden shifting that is also happening in NATO, meaning we didn't have enough capabilities before, and now we have to provide even more. And the war in Ukraine showed very clearly also the weakness of Europe. So we have provided different plans, rearm, the white paper, the defense readiness roadmap. I will not go into the details because I'm sure that Commissioner Kubilius did. But what I want to say, because that's a question that we get very often, we work very closely and very well with NATO in this. And what has happened is that for the first time, the EU is explicitly using its instruments, for example, its budgetary and regulatory power, to support the 23 EU member states that are also NATO allies in achieving their NATO targets. That means that we have taken the NATO needs and that we are using our instruments to provide as much support to member states as possible when, for example, they need to acquire the different capabilities. We have made plans. We have defined priorities, and now it's really about implementation. And of course, about getting industry to produce as fast and best as possible. A third aspect that I want to speak about are partnerships. We have invested a lot in our global ties, and it's a very interesting dynamic that we can observe. The more countries all across the globe feel that they are not secure in their own regions anymore, they come and they look for strong partners. So we have many countries across the globe that come to us and want to cooperate with us in lots of different fields. We have had dialogues for a long time. We have now also created dedicated security and defense partnerships, which signify an even closer cooperation, and signed them with 9 countries so far. And the last thing are, of course, also very, very visible expression of partnerships and of support are military and civilian missions. We have 21 of them so far. Around 5,000 civilian and military personnel is deployed around the world. And just to give you a few insights, we have, of course, Operation Aspides, which is a key player to protect maritime shipping from Houthis' sophisticated armed attacks, to ensure these operations have, and we need to ensure that's also then for you, that these operations have the right means for member states. They need to be adequately staffed, resourced, and then different civilian missions. We are talking about them a lot at the moment, for example, in Gaza, where the peace agreement offers a unique chance to stabilize the Middle East, and it's now key to move to phase 2. So release of all hostages and Israeli withdrawal, and to restore a functioning Palestinian presence in Gaza free from Hamas. We are working to expand mandates of the 2 missions that we have. One is to help with border crossing, and the other one is police training. Lebanon, it's again another very important topic where we might have to do more. The government took a historic decision to launch a nationwide disarmament and reinstate the monopoly of the use of force. And we already scaled up our assistance of the Lebanese armed forces. And you might know that the UN is the UN mission, UNIFIL, will also start withdrawal as of the end of next year. So we need to see what can be done to support Lebanon, and we think that we might have to step up there. Cooperation is crucial, and I thank you because, as I said at the beginning, you are really the important voices that we need to transmit everything that we do, to explain it, but also to ensure that we get the resources that we need for our work and the support that we need for our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benedicta. So now we could start, and first of all, we start with the MEP, Pekka. To vary from EP.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the briefing. I'm an old strategic planner, and what irritates me, so to say, is that when we talk about the Ukrainian war, I don't think that the European Union has any real strategy how to stop the war. We say that we support Ukraine as long as needed. For me, it means that our strategy is let the Ukrainians bleed to death slowly, death by 1,000 cuts, because we don't have any better plan. And I'm just wondering, why don't we have a strategic plan to end the war within a year and then use the tool which is our greatest strength, is our economic power? We've gradually have increased sanctions slowly but surely. Now its 20th package is ongoing. If we would have put in all those 20 packets together and hit Russia with them the first year, it would have had totally different effect. This is like in the Second World War when the Allied bombed left and right in Europe before they finally understood that, well, actually, instead of bombing cities, let's bomb the oil production of Germany, and that had an effect. Same thing. We don't seem to know what we aim at with the sanctions, and I think that, if you had a clear strategy to put Russia to its knees and then give some economic and military planners task to plan sanctions that would get that effect, we would be there already. This is tracking on, and it's every day people die in Ukraine. So I was wondering, what's the problem here that we don't hit earlier, faster, and with bigger force? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that once this is over, we will look back and think about what we could have done better. For me, it's really about looking forward right now. And I said we have two approaches. One is to apply pressure. The other one is to support. And I also think, of course, things can always be different and things can always be more ideal. At the same time, when you look at what the EU has done, I think the EU has changed completely over its support to Ukraine. Who would have thought before the war that the EU would support also financially the delivery of weapons to a country at war? This had never been done before. The sums that have been spent, it's over 66 billion euros in military equipment so far, 25 billion euros this year in military equipment alone. So could we do more? Of course, always, and I'm sure that would be very much appreciated. At the same time, it's also historic what we have done so far. We have, as you said, we are now talking about the 20th sanctions package. We have started sanctioning entities and countries that we have not sanctioned so far. I speak about China, for example. If you look at the effects of these sanctions, I think that our pressure also works. I also said that there are big financial needs for Ukraine at the moment, and we need to see how we cover them. As I pointed out, there are different options that were put forward by the Commission, and these are the options that we are currently discussing. And the best thing we can do is ensure that Ukraine has the military, but also the financial support it needs for basically everything from budget to military.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mr. Conicescu from Romania.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleague, for many years, Romania has been warning its European partners and NATO allies about Russian threats in the Black Sea region. Subsequent events in Ukraine have proven that our warnings were correct. Romania has consistently called for a stronger NATO presence on its territory, and now the European Union strategic approach for the Black Sea region discusses the Black Sea Maritime Security Hub. This hub can be hosted by Romania with the potential to become a key point in the European Union security architecture, directly contributing to protecting the eastern flank and integrating European efforts with those of NATO. What can you tell us about this project? When can we see it actually implemented in Romania? And how will this project be financed? Thank you very much.
I can tell you that it's a very important topic that we discuss a lot. Of course, we have a very close look at all, I would say, 360 degrees. Black Sea is hugely important. Black Sea Hub is something that we discuss a lot internally between the different entities who are concerned. And of course, also with the member states, and I would say member states plus, who are the literal state. So what do? We coordinate with them, because the most important thing is to understand what do these member states want, what are the plans, in what way can we support. And of course we're coordinating also with NATO to ensure that what we do is coherent. We do, for example, there are talks also with the Coast Guard. What we do is we support in the area of undersea cables monitoring, and we are looking into what more can be done in the future. So I can assure you that it's a topic that is very much on our minds, and we are using our instruments as best as possible to support.
Thank you very much. The next will be Jani Koko from Finland.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and also thank you for all the speakers during these 2 days. Many of the commentators have asked that what we should do to be more efficient and act faster. Well, the obvious answer is that we have to make decisions to show that we have political power and political willingness to do what it takes to be done, and argumenting that to our own constituency when we are going to boost our defense. That's the key issue in this European defense project, that we will show the political will. The other is that we shouldn't afraid Russia, because history has shown that Russia will obey force. That's the only thing they respect. And now we have to promote force, the European power that we have in our arsenal. I mean, for example, we should add complete travel ban, those individuals who are traveling with the Russian passports to the European Union. If they violate our common airspace with their military aircraft, we should shoot them down like what Turkey did in 2015 in their border, and also support more Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has drawn, 11, 12 red lines that West cannot cross when we are supporting Ukraine, and we have crossed all of them. So I think that we should make even more to strengthen their defense capabilities, allow them to strike inside the Russian territories, because they are, at the moment, the Ukrainians are fighting and dying so that we wouldn't have to.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more with your last statement. So we are doing a lot. We are, of course, learning also. If you look at the sanctions packages, they have developed a lot. You mentioned the free movement, for example, of Russian diplomats inside the EU. That was part of the 19th sanctions package. We now have much stricter controls on the movement. And we are doing more in terms of both the pressure that we apply and also the support. I said it as an answer to the first question. You mentioned the deep strike into Russian territory. That's something that is also supported as part of the Ukrainian defense. And also when you look at the question of hybrid attacks, and I think hybrid is always too nice a word, I think it's really destabilization attacks. I think they are the much more poignant term. There we also support more and more in a more target way Ukraine.
Thank you very much. The next will be MEP Pierre-Romain Thionnet from the Patriots.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be speaking French. I wanted to come back to the whole question of financial assistance to Ukraine, which was raised by a colleague. You've talked about the urgent needs that Ukraine has. 135 billion euros for 2026-27 alone is estimated by the Commission. Now, we saw recently that the European Central Bank has stated it has serious reserves about using this. Also, Euroclear has expressed strong reservations, as well as the Belgian Prime Minister, who has said that this a proposal is not acceptable to him. So I guess my question is an easy one. Have we reached an impasse here? This idea of using the frozen Russian assets. Should we maybe look for other ways forward? Now, here in the room, there are a number of national parliamentarians who are facing their own domestic budgetary debates in their own member states. So beyond the whole question of this impasse on the frozen Russian assets, what are other concrete ways forward that we could explore to support Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I can tell you that every single of these pieces has been explored, and we looked at all the different options. The support has been incredibly strong in the past few years, and that also means that different sources are running dry. So the options are becoming smaller and smaller. This is why we focus so strongly on the frozen assets. I believe that's very important. There are, as I said, the Commission put forward an options paper, and there are discussions going on internally right now, and I can't comment on them, but they are ongoing right now on whether, and if so, how we can use these assets. But they would provide a very important financial source to pay for the support to Ukraine to ensure that it's militarily strong. It's Russia that has inflicted the damage, and it should be Russia that pays, and it shouldn't be the European taxpayer. So we need to see how we can do this, and of all the proposals there are, this is one that we look at very closely, and that is hugely important because, as I said, the other funds are running dry.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mrs. Catherine Callahan from Ireland.
Thank you. Gaumid buicas liv golera dus. Kinta gwils shiakon is over anatavachtach I gora muncher erinig. Thank you, first of all.
Sorry, we have every language, not Irish.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
In this
I'll
case,
revert.
sorry.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for organising this meeting of countries who have the ongoing preservation of the shared values EU member states hold most dear. We're holding them now to the forefront of our minds. Peace is a subject that is very important in conversations in Ireland. It is important to remember that Ireland may be militarily neutral, but we are not politically neutral. On Tuesday this week, we had President Zelensky visit Dáil Éireann, our national parliament, and acknowledge the contribution Ireland has made in supporting Ukraine with millions of euros worth of non-lethal aid, as well as providing shelter for tens of thousands of Ukrainian nationals. Ireland has consistently supported Ukraine's accession to the EU, and we will continue to support Ukraine as it continues to fight its fight against Russian aggression for its own sake, but also for Europe's sake and the values that we all hold dear. In Ireland, we have just passed the largest defence budget in the history of the state. We have our first ever female Minister for Defence, and while we face the same challenges with increasing our military personnel strength as many other EU member states are facing, I have to say that Ireland takes matters of defence and national security very seriously, And we not only recognise the need for ongoing year-on-year increasing investment, but we are also actively increasing our budget, as already indicated. Ireland has a defence force that is recognised internationally for its peacekeeping record. In relation to the conversation we're having here today about our shared responsibility to protect our citizens in light of the growth of hybrid threats, cyber attacks and geopolitical instability, which all countries in the EU face, I feel Ireland's geographical position, our tech ecosystem and Atlantic maritime assets make us critical partners in safeguarding Europe's digital and critical physical infrastructure now and into the future. Like all lasting partnership, each member state needs to play to its own strengths, and we each have different strengths. I believe Ireland's upcoming EU presidency provides an opportunity to emphasise security through cooperation, focusing on resilience, innovation and democratic values rather than militarisation, in line with our own neutrality. Therefore, my question is to ask what we think about the future and further development of an EU Atlantic security strategy, broadly in line with EU's strategic agenda 2024-29, which emphasises security, resilience and democratic stability. I'm interested in your thoughts.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Ireland for its very important contribution. You mentioned your neutrality. We see very important support from Ireland in lots of different fields when it comes to security and, for example, also the support to Ukraine. So thank you very much for that. And the same goes, I mentioned the different missions at the beginning also for these missions. The strategy you referred to, there was no planning to do something like that. Maybe at some point it would be worthwhile. At the moment, we are very busy planning what we should do more in Europe. We have the debate that I referred to in NATO regarding the burden shifting. So we know the changes in the transatlantic relationship, and we are trying to do our share, our responsibility as best as possible when it comes to European and EU defense. Thank you.
So the next will be Mrs. Fatima Zira Belhirch, I hope it's correct, from the Netherlands.
Thank you, Chair. With the war in Ukraine, we have seen that we have been naive for many years in taking our democratic freedom for granted, and therefore it's very important to support long-term with financial aid and military support Ukraine, the people, the children, the women and men. But what we also see, more than 120 conflicts in the world. And we have been discussing today, also correctly, the need to strengthen our defense, and it's more than necessary. But with defense alone, we don't get to peace and stability and security. We need also a more integrated approach, so not only silos. So what I also want to hear is how do we also in the European Union integrate more defense, diplomacy, international cooperation, but also international trade. But we need also resilience in other ways to prevent conflict and also to improve more our efforts in peace building and reconstruction. And another question is, these are what we were talking about, the classic threats, but we see also an increase in cyber threats in many ways. So there was one about the drones, but also how are we making ourselves more resilient regarding to cyber threats? Thank you.
So I can, people often say the EU is so complex. That's true. It's hard to understand from the outside. That's something I often hear. The beautiful thing about this is that the reason is that the EU has so many different layers, and that also means that the EU has so many different answers to one problem. And we always look at these answers together. Of course, we are talking about defense today, but I can tell you, for example, when we look at should we establish a mission, I have these talks with the Director General of the EU military staff very often. We will not do this unless we have an integrated approach. he is firm, and I fully agree that we can't send the military to a place unless we have a holistic strategy employing all the instruments that the EU has to offer. You mentioned a few of them. So diplomatic tools, economic tools, trade is of course important, development. There are so many different programs that we can use, and so the palette is huge. And we are learning better and better to combine this to integrated approach. So I fully agree with you, we shouldn't work in silos, and in the same way that we are learning to make these partnerships more tailored, more targeted, we are also learning to use our tools in an integrated way as best as possible. On the threats and cyber threats, how can we become more resilient? It's a very important question because the number of attacks is staggering. It's rising every single day. And we are doing many different things. You know that we have the cyber toolbox, which basically again says that we employ every single means that we have to make member states stronger. It means calling out adversaries. So public attribution is very important. Sanctions are very important. We have a hybrid sanctions regime now that that is quite new, and we have based the first sanctions on this. We are also about to establish, and that is very important because the support also has to come from you, a Cyber Defense Coordination Center, which basically means ensuring that the military cyber centers of the member states are connected, that we have shared situational awareness, that we support each other in our responses, and that we can also do shared responses. That is one part where we still need to do more in the future. We have the plans, we have started to set it up, but it's something that needs to grow, and it can only grow if we have the support, for example, from the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next will be MEP Martin Starkis from the Greens.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to ask you the questions, and you have also, I think, very good on answers. I have the constant contact with the Ukrainian soldiers, and I will start with the good news. Lately, I don't hear many complaints or criticism about our supplies, at least when it comes to the personal equipment, ammunition, weapons, and so on. Of course, they're still missing the long-range missiles and air defense, drones, funds, but most importantly, they miss the troops, of course, the manpower. But my question is, how much of our supplies, what we supply to Ukraine, are procured from United States? If you can tell me in percentage, or produced in United States, or comes from US military, and what would happen if one day the US carries out the threat to cut the supplies? Thank you.
I can't tell you in percentage. I can tell you that US support was crucial in the first years, and this year it has gone down a lot. I think that's something that you can read publicly everywhere. I can also tell you that we are highly dependent on US support. That goes for military equipment, but that also goes for intel, for example. So that is another reason why we have to become stronger in Europe, because we cannot act independently at the moment. If we wanted to support Ukraine on our own, we would have huge problems. And intel, amongst many others, you also mentioned deep strike capabilities, is one of the gaps that we have, and one of the gaps that we urgently need to fill. You know, the whole discussion, or it's not a discussion, it's an initiative of PEARL that is ongoing in NATO. So there is a concerted effort to procure equipment from the US. We had, with the European Peace Facility, we procured from the world market, including from the US. We basically supported the delivery of equipment basically from those states that could provide it. and that includes the US. I don't have the exact numbers. We didn't count the percentage, but what is important is, as I said, the reliance, and I would say over-reliance on the US. And that is a question that we need to ask ourselves: how strong do we want to be? How independent do we want to be? And with this, I don't mean the EU, because the NATO is the organization in Europe that is responsible for the operational, for the military defense of Europe. But we as EU, of course, support this process, and we need to ask ourselves, what do we want to be able to do? And the US very clearly has handed over a responsibility for conventional defense in Europe to Europe. That is the whole burden shifting that I refer to, that comes with a very long list of tasks, and it doesn't have to be concluded today, but it has to be concluded very soon. And that means that we need to do everything to be prepared to ensure that we have the right industry in place. And that's everything that I mentioned in my initial statement, that we need to cooperate better amongst each other in order to spend the money that we have as wisely as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 2 questions left. So if you have questions, we have 20 minutes time for answering. So we continue with Mr. Gerard Crowell from Ireland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and once again, thank you for today. Being Irish and coming from a country that values a neutrality I don't necessarily believe in, I find myself somewhat conflicted here today. I've made the point on a number of occasions: Europe is moving towards militarization. I suppose merging together of NATO and Europe leaves 4 countries outside this new alliance, if you want to call it that. So I'm wondering, as we prepare for war, if the inevitable happens, where will those 4 countries stand? Will you respect Austria? Will you respect Malta? Will you respect Cyprus? Will you respect Ireland? And in particular, yesterday I made the point that Ireland is the largest aircraft carrier in the world, with 4 fine airports that could be used in a very strategic location. Will you respect our right not to allow anybody on our soil? Not that we can stop you. We only spend 0.23% of our GDP on defence. We are struggling to try and come up to speed. But I really do wonder, as a parliamentarian, how do I explain to people in Ireland that Europe, the great economic project, is moving to a great military project? Not that I don't support it, but nonetheless, I'm just one individual. There are 5.5 million people in my country, most of whom would regard what we're talking about here today as out-and-out heresy. Perhaps I'd welcome your views. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can assure you that we always respect the national specificities of each of our member states, and that we never leave out any of our member states. So, of course, every single of the 27 member states is in all the discussions that we have. We have consensus principles. So all the 4 that you pointed out, including your own country, are, of course, part of every decision that we make. You talk about the militarization, increasing militarization of Europe. That's a question that I'm being asked quite often. What is this rearming of Europe? We thought you were a peace project. I think what we all have to be very conscious of is that the reason why we're doing this is because we want to preserve peace, because we want to be able to defend ourselves. We are much more unlikely to be attacked if we are strong. If we are weak, if we don't have the means to counter, if we're not resilient enough, that is what puts us in danger. So by investing in defense, by sharpening our instruments, that is the best support to peace and the best guarantee for peace that we can have. So that's something that every member state needs to decide how it wishes to contribute to. But it's the underlying principle that I think every member state agreed to, and it does so in whatever shape or form the national specificities, the constitutions, etc. allow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next will be my colleague MEP José Rada from the S&D.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask in Spanish, please. Bueno, primero, muchas gracias por...
So first of all, I would like to thank you. Thank you very much for having organized this meeting. It's important to share our work that we do in the national parliaments here at the European Parliament, because I want to say it loudly without wanting to scare anyone. Europe is in a war. We are in cyber wars, and we know that this is serious. Now, as the EEAS representative said, we can't only be in a defensive position, but also we can't be only defensive, we need to be offensive. We have to think of security and defense, and over the last decades, we haven't done all we needed to do, and that's why we need to work for strategic autonomy. The colleague was asking about percentages and how much we are buying from the US. From what I know, it's around 65%. And that's the European consumption, so to speak. So we have a very strong dependency on other countries. So I wanted to ask a question. It's something I want to share with the other colleagues as well here in the EU. The fact is that the first step to guarantee protection, whatever the conflict, our tools mean that we need an intelligence service. Now, I know that Ursula von der Leyen has already spoken about this formally lately. I know that there's also controversy because the 27 member states think that intelligence is a national competence. It's a question of national defense and that you can't share intelligence. Now, I understand this point of view, but if we really recognize the threats and the dangers, then we know that our national defense and security of each one of the 27 countries means we have to think of everyone together, of European security. We have an excellent service. We have people who are doing their jobs, but we need more resources as well. We have to keep taking steps towards a single European intelligence service in order to take European decisions. We need to move in this direction. We can't have 27 reports, 27 opinions, and sometimes there are even contradictions between these reports. So we need to take steps forward. So I would like to know, and I'm taking advantage of the fact that we have people from 27 states, so I would like to know what we are doing now towards this goal of having an intelligence service, because it's necessary to preserve our goals.
Thank you very much. Okay, I didn't get the joke, but I'm glad I made you laugh. We
also jokes, please. We are micro, so that everybody could hear it.
No, solamente decía que siento...
No, I simply want to state that I don't know if this is a possible question. It can be a bit difficult because we're speaking about initiatives from von der Leyen. I just wanted to say that I hope it's not too controversial.
Well, we are speaking about intelligence, and I can tell you that we have INSEN and SAIC that are the single point of entry in EU institutions for intelligence. How does it work? It works that the member states feed the intelligence into the EU, and it's analyzed there. So what we do is we encourage member states to share. The more member states share, the better our our view is of what is going on out there. So we have a very good system, and of course it lives with its contributions. The better the contributions, the better the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next will be Mr. Andrzej Grzyb from Poland.
Vielen Dank, Madam Vorsitzende. I continue in Polish language. Bardzo dobrze zdefiniowano.
The title of this panel has been defined very well. Europe's defense at a turning point. I think that it's a very good diagnosis. Because why? Why are we at this turning point? Somebody here asked how he can explain to the Irish people the need to militarize. Well, the reason is the Russian war against Ukraine, which did not start 4 years ago. It started in 2014. This is a war at the borders, at the external borders of the EU and NATO. So we must realize that this threat has not come from the EU or from NATO. Without our will, we became the flank of a conflict that is happening in the East. And when we look at all the sanctions, as someone here said, if we took them all together, if they would have been much more effective. They are spread over time. And I have a question about the geopolitical rivalry with China and the challenges that are related to that. Maybe you could comment on that, as well as on the threats which come from informal groups. We see what the Wagner group does in Africa, for example. I think this should also be discussed because the consequences of that are felt even today in terms of migration, etc., etc. This was, in a way, stimulated by these groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You asked about China. China is a competitor, China is a rival, and China is a partner where we can. We talk a lot about China. I mentioned it in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. China is a very important enabler there. Without China, Russia would not be able to do what it's currently doing. We see that, to give you one example, more than 80% of the dual-use goods that are found on the battlefield in Ukraine come either from or through China. This is just one of many examples. So we need to we addressing that very clearly. China is for the first time sanctioned Chinese entities through direct and indirect sanctions. So we are addressing that. We are also addressing that in our dialogues, and it's very important to say what we see, what we observe, and to say what the consequences of this are. You also mentioned Wagner in Africa, a very important topic indeed. We see that Wagner is very active. We see which countries are cooperating with Wagner. In the end, I think it is about who can make an attractive offer. These countries that cooperate with, be it Wagner or other providers, they have different needs, so we need to analyze these needs, and we need to analyze what would it cost to provide them. So can we align that with our interests, with our values. If we can, then we need to provide an attractive offer. That's why I said earlier in my statement, we are learning to tailor much better the partnerships that we have, the missions, operations that we conduct with these, the needs of these partners to ensure that we provide fast support and efficient support to cover the needs and the gaps that they have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next will be Pavel Fischer from the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to continue the question or the debate launched by my honourable colleague from Ireland, who challenged us on how to speak about the looming war to the people who are living in neutral countries. I think that we have to admit that the conflict is today not only military, but also we see that there is a weaponization of many agendas or issues that we didn't relate it to war. It is the example of energy, for instance, where weaponization of energy became a trap, strategic trap for the whole Europe. And here I have to praise the action of the European Union and European Commission particularly for having addressed this strategically and helping to liberate EU member states from this dependency. Similarly, we saw that the weaponization of migration and illegal migration became a real concern for countries on the eastern flank. And last but not least, the many cyber attacks that we have to solve in our countries, sometimes challenging the security of hospitals, is something that we have to take into account. An attack on hospital is an act of war. And if we see that this is a state-related actor behind, we have to conclude that there is a real danger that we are challenged from the international law viewpoint on a very important issue. And my question goes now to Madam Director General. You spoke about sanctions against PRC, and this is a very good news because PRC or China became a real enabler of this conflict that Russia is developing against European security. My question is, how do you see this strategic trap of technological dependency? Because the European Commission succeeded to avoid this strategic trap of energetic dependency with Russia. How do you advise to navigate that we do not become 100% dependent on China, which disrespects the fundamental principles of the European cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say something about your statement, to which I couldn't agree more, on the question of how to speak to the populations. You mentioned the 4 neutral member states, but I think it's the task in every member state to explain what is going on, to create awareness of the threats, to use the right language, because as I said, with hybrid, it almost seems to me like it's too harmless word, and that we need to use a different language to explain better what the problem is, like destabilization, for example. But this is, I think, a very difficult yet crucial task of every parliamentarian, of every politician, of every government, to ensure to be in a close dialogue with their citizens, to explain what is going on, what are the responses, what resources are needed for these responses. And I appreciate, I completely respect that it's a tough challenge, because of course resources will always be finite. That means if we need to invest much more in one area, what does it mean for other areas? That is a decision that every member state has to take for itself. And what is clear is that we have to do more if we want to be safe. And I find it interesting when you travel to different countries, like for example the Ukraine. They are so eager in to join the European Union. The values attached, the freedoms attached, the prosperity that comes with being in the EU, being part of this group, the safety and security that comes with being part of this group. It's something that I think too many take for granted. It's something that I believe we need to fight for every single day, and that we need to be very aware of what we have. We are incredibly lucky with the freedoms that we have, and with the world we have created in the EU. And I think we need to really do everything to maintain that. And I've never seen it in my career, and I've been doing this for more than 20 years, jeopardized as much as it is now. I think there's a very serious threat, and we are now getting ready, but our adversaries will not wait until we are ready. So we need to do everything as quickly as possible. And part of that is to explain what we are fighting for, and to make sure that what we have is not taken for granted, but it's a luxury that others would be, are striving with every fiber of their being to have. So I want to underline that. And then very briefly on the question of technological dependency, I think what we've learned in a very painful way in the last few years is that dependencies are never good, whatever they are on, whether they're on energy, whether they're on trade, whether they're on technology, whether they're on security. We must diversify, and the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she gave a very strong speech on de-risking from China. So it's really about understanding, where can we cooperate? As I said, there's also the question: can we be partners? Where are we rivals? Where are we competitors? So it's not about cutting all links, but it's about de-risking, and it's about ensuring that we still can function in a way that we can produce what we need, for example. And of course, technology is one important part of that. And it's a very important discussion that is being led with member states, that is taking place in the Commission. So something that we are very aware of and trying to tackle as constructively as possible.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, MEP Malika Sorel. The floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'ai quelques observations.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I would like to make a few comments. Of course, we have to work to strengthen our defense, but what can we do? Because we have threats, and we mustn't increase our weaknesses. We don't have a 360-degree strategy. So I would like you to express an opinion on these examples. Terrorism. Our borders are open. They are not controlled sufficiently. Secondly, we are setting up political actions to empty Maghreb and parts of Africa of their elites, of doctors and engineers, and the Islamists are using this argument to increase hate against us and to promote terrorism on our soil. Technologically, we're not doing anything to get our engineers back, the ones that left to the US. I have the figures. If the French engineers left the tech industry would collapse. So we also have brain drain. We have a colleague who spoke of intelligence services. So perhaps in our committee, we should do something to talk about intelligence, to analyze the infiltrations taking place in the research and innovation sector, because there is foreign interference. And then last point, politicians go into companies in countries that are hostile to us. This should be forbidden. So could you please express your opinion on these points? Because I think we need a strategy that is complete, a 360-degree strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can assure you that we are looking at everything. So both in defense, there is a 360-degree, as well as in geographical terms, there's a 360-degree approach. We have member states that are very keen on this, and they make sure that everything is looked at. You mentioned terrorism or countering terrorism. For us, that is one very important task. I have a whole counterterrorism team in my department. So what do we want to do? We want to strengthen partners. You mentioned borders. We need to ensure that that we strengthen partners as best as possible. That goes. The support is very has many different layers, from support to societies, from financial support, from basically doing everything to make sure that societies are as resilient as possible to terrorism, and that we are as aware as possible of the threats, and that we can respond to the threats as best as possible. Multilateral cooperation is very important in this. Linking our cooperation to other entities, bodies, is also important here. Europol is a very important one. And then you mentioned, you go on to a very different topic, the engineers. That is outside my field, but I can tell you that if we talk about strengthening industry, of course, we also need engineers. It's something that I know is looked at very closely. There are of course, efforts to do this, both on the way by member states, but also it's a very important topic for the Commission. So it's very much in our on our radar. Thank you.
So, dear colleagues, I switch into my language. Liebe Kolleginnen und
colleagues, the reason I'm changing languages is that I have something that I want to get off my chest, and I can do that better in my own language. First of all, thank you very much indeed for coming to Brussels. I know that you had to travel, and sometimes that's very tiring. But you did that to come here. It's the first time we've had this meeting, the first time in the history of the European Parliament. We have military, we have defenders of democracy from all countries here just about. We'll do the same thing soon, because some colleagues were unable to come because they were in the middle of negotiations of their budgets. I'd like to thank Benedicta and everybody for answering the questions and for asking questions. I think ping pong is a lot more satisfactory than when you try and collect 5 questions, and then when you get round to answering, you can't remember what the questions were. I'd like to thank everybody from CD and from my own bureau, everybody who's made it possible to have this meeting. You're very good at organizing these things. The first time you do anything is a big challenge. So thank you very much to you. Thank you to your team. Thank you to the interpreters who make it possible for us to communicate. Colleagues, I think this has been very interesting. As you know, I was the head of the Committee for Defense in the German Parliament, and a few weeks later, Russia attacked Ukraine for the second time. So I was elected in the middle of that, and for the last 4 years, I've been focusing on this war. I've traveled to the site of the war, and I will do so again. This war affects all of us, not just the members of the EU or the candidate countries. It affects the neutral countries like Ireland, Malta, Austria, and also affects the NATO countries. And countries like Switzerland are very interested in what we're doing. The SAFE program where you can participate as a non-EU country. And obviously we're discussing with Norway and UK and other countries who want to cooperate closely with us. Because irrespective of whether you're an EU country and a NATO country or just a NATO country, we're all on the same continent and we're part of the biggest peace initiative of the country. If you think of the situation in the 70s and 80s, you couldn't imagine a situation that we have at the moment where young people can travel all over the country and can work wherever they like. And I believe in that project, but there are countries around us who want to destroy this project, including Russia, and it would be very dangerous if we allow Putin and others to think that we're weak and unable to defend ourselves. There's been attempted to make people believe that. 69% of people who were asked in the context of a survey in the biggest countries in Europe, 69% feel that Europe would not be able to defend itself. And a lot of people don't read newspapers anymore. They get all their information from the net, and their statements are made which are not corrected, and there's a lot of fake news around. And it's very dangerous if we start making that our reality. I believe in this peace project. I've been here in the European Parliament for a bit more than a year, and I didn't take that step lightly because I enjoyed being a German member of parliament, but I feel that only if we stand together will we survive. And I'm not just talking militarily, I'm also talking about politically. We're a minority in the world. You travel as much as I do. We've been discussing what happened. We haven't discussed so much what happened in Africa. There's virtually not a region where people can have a decent life. I went with some colleagues to Red Sea, where we also have a European mandate to guarantee the sea routes. And it's in our interest that our shipping can travel safely and can transport goods safely so that we can maintain welfare. All of that is at stake. It's not just a war in Ukraine, although they're heroic in defending themselves, but there's a situation in Europe where we are neither at war nor are we at peace, because we have these hybrid attacks, which I think is an aggression. Everybody's looking to Europe. Europe is the wealthy region that everybody wants to travel to. So everybody's looking to us. Are we just singing the ode to joy, or are we actually doing something about defending ourselves? I think it's very refreshing to see who comes from what country and what different perspectives you have. It's a different situation if you're in the Mediterranean or if you have a Russian border, but we're all part of a whole. And I think it's a huge privilege to be here today. Thank you all very much. I hope to see you soon in your own countries or here in the European Parliament in Brussels. I wish you a healthy and happy return to your home, and take home this message. It's great to be part of Europe. See you soon.